Hello, 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 hello. All right. Now that we are thick in the heart of some metaphysical conversations as it relates to identity and as it relates to brains and bats and as it relates to kind of conceptions of ourselves, um, I thought it would be entertaining and interesting to potentially look at this short little piece that I use in my regular 240 class, called I Am John's Brain, written by Andy Clark. And I came across this piece, and I just think it's clever, right? Especially if it kind of deals with subjects that we've been kind of talking about um, as it relates to notions of kind of our connectedness with ourselves, and where does the self actually exist? Does it exist here? Does it exist here? Does it exist everywhere? What is a self in and of itself, right? And in thinking about that, I really like this piece because what it does is it kind of examines something that we are utterly kind of intimately aware of and familiar of. It's helping me speak these words right now, think these thoughts right now, move my hands the way that I'm moving my hands, operating this camera and this computer. But yet, I don't actually feel, I don't actually feel as if, right? Like, I don't feel the synapses going off in my brain. I don't feel their connectivity. I don't experience that necessarily firsthand, but I do experience them firsthand, right? And so this is what's I think really interesting about this piece is it gives us kind of as a thought experiment to consider, right, what it is like and what our relationship with our brain might be. Moreover, and you'll see that this is, the requirement of your reflection. But what is the distinction between the brain and the mind? Is there a distinction at all? If so, what is it? How do we account for it? How do we know about it? Right? And then I think maybe more interestingly that if there is a mind, if the mind exists, well, where is it located? Is it located in the brain? Is it located in this space of mental brain capacity? Or is it located somewhere else? Where does it exist, if it exists at all? Right? And so this is a fascinating piece by Clark to kind of like, again, allow us to examine that relationship a little bit more of and in thinking about, right, what the relationship between like us and our brain is, but even that like phrasing speaks distinction where maybe there's no distinction at all, right? The brain is certainly part of us. So, and I think this is clever, right? We don't actually know what our brains look like. I mean, maybe we've seen pictures of brains in anatomy textbooks or in other areas, other ways, but really, like, we know it's up there. We know it's locked in a skull, right? But I mean, thinking about this in the first sentence, I think is really clever. I am just a rather undistinguished looking gray-white mass of cells. My surface is heavy, convoluted, and I possess a fairly differential internal structure. John and I are on rather close and intimate terms. Indeed, sometimes it's hard to tell us apart, but at times John takes his intimacy a little too far. When that happens, he gets very confused about my role and functioning. He imagines that I organize and process information in ways that echo his perspective of the world. In short, he thinks that his thoughts are, in a rather direct sense, my thoughts. This is true in some ways, right? But also, it's much more complicated, right? And so as you kind of like go through this piece and you kind of like look through that, it goes into that kind of convoluted, you know, um, convoluted kind of more complicated areas than just, this kind of intimately my thoughts or my brain's thoughts, right? And so as we kind of work through here and as you kind of like work through the article, pay close attention to kind of how, the brain is talking about the relationship with John. Okay? And they go through this idea of like a dashboard display, which I'll let you kind of entangle with that as your own, right? And then this idea of like the province of thoughts. John thinks of me as the point source of the intellectual products he identifies as thoughts, but to put it crudely, I do not have John's thoughts. John has John's thoughts, and I am just one item in the array of physical events and process which enable that thinking to occur. Okay, so again, the brain is making the claim, if we take this piece seriously, the brain is making the claim that the brain does not have John's thoughts, but John has John's thoughts. Right? So, again, kind of like including that in a really interesting way of thinking, right? And, and then they go on to an example here, or the brain goes on to an example. A few days ago, John sat at his desk and worked for a rather hard, sustained period of time, eventually got up, satisfied with the day's work. My brain, he reflected, and he has done very well. It has come up with some really neat ideas, right? But did the brain come up with the ideas, or did John come up with the ideas? And if so, right, where is that distinction? Where is that relation? Okay. Yeah, I think this piece is fun. I think this piece is cool. Right? At root, John's mistakes are all variations of a single thing. He thinks that I see the world as he does, that I parcel things up the way he would, and I think the way that he would represent his thought. Rather, right, the brain is claiming there's some alien source. And this is something that we kind of talked about with identity just last week, but, damage to me, meaning the brain, could, for example, result in the selective impairment of John's capacity to recall the names of small manipulable objects, right? And yet leave unscathed his capacity to recall names of bigger ones. So this idea that even if the brain was damaged, right, there would still be that distinction of some things John could do and couldn't do in response to the brain being damaged, right? And so again, maybe John, still can be kind of independent or act independently of his brain processes. Okay. So, and so I'm just going to leave it at that, actually, and I'm going to let you kind of entangle and engage with the rest of the piece. And as you'll notice, right, your response paper is such that it's asking about the distinction between the mind and the brain. And I do think that, this piece kind of touches on this. This piece kind of, showcases a little bit of that distinction of the idea of consciousness, the idea of sentience, the idea of where does that sentience occur? How does it occur? Right? Is it a product of the brain? Is it a product of something else? All the while, right, still kind of at the core of this metaphysical examination, examining how, with all these pieces, examining how, right, it feeds into our conception of our identity. Okay, so taking that for what it is, and hopefully that gives you more to think about, because it's kind of exciting, it's kind of trippy, it's kind of fun.